You know, we've all asked the question, why do we get sick? But for thousands of years, that question was tangled up with a much heavier one. What did I do to deserve this? Today, we're going to dig into the Bible's really complex and honestly pretty surprising take on the link between sickness and sin. Let's get into it.
So this is the big one, right? Is getting sick a punishment for something you did wrong? For a lot of ancient cultures, the answer was a simple and kind of terrifying yes. The idea that your physical suffering was a direct result of your moral failures, well, that was just how people thought. And the biblical world was no different. But, as you're about to see, the real story is way more complicated than that.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at that traditional, old-school link between sickness and sin. Then, we'll see how that whole idea starts getting challenged. We'll even introduce a new suspect in the story of suffering, unpack a huge mistranslation that's caused centuries of confusion, and finally, we'll reframe the whole conversation from medicine to ritual. Okay, so our journey starts with the oldest and most common assumption you'll find in the Bible. If you're sick, it's because somebody sinned. Either you did, or maybe your parents did. This was seen as a pretty straightforward system of divine justice, simple cause and effect. And it's really interesting to see how this plays out, even in the New Testament. There's this incredible story in the Gospel of Mark where these guys are so desperate to get their paralyzed friend to Jesus that they actually tear a hole in the roof to lower him down. But the very first thing Jesus says to this man isn't "you're healed." It's something else, something that tells you everything about how people at the time thought about sickness.
He says, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now, for everyone who was watching, this made total sense. Of course, to fix the body, you had to fix the soul first. Jesus was going right to what they saw as the spiritual root cause, the sin, before even touching the physical symptom. To that crowd, the man's paralysis and his sin were just two sides of the same coin.
But here's where things get really interesting. Just when it seems like that idea is set in stone, the story starts to pivot. The New Testament actually begins to challenge and complicate this direct line between a specific sin and a specific sickness. A whole new way of thinking starts to pop up.
This moment from the Gospel of John just nails the old mindset. The disciples see a man who was born blind, and their immediate reaction isn't, "How can we help him?" Nope, it's, "Who's to blame?" The only two options they can even think of are that either he sinned or his parents did. For them, it had to be someone's fault.
And this is where Jesus just drops the bombshell. He completely rejects their whole premise. It's not the man's fault, it's not his parents' fault. Jesus offers this third option that nobody was even considering, that suffering could be an arena, a stage, for God's power and glory to be put on display.
So this is a massive shift in thinking. The old assumption was a neat, tidy little equation. Sin equals suffering as punishment, period. But Jesus just breaks that equation wide open. He says suffering isn't always a punishment. Sometimes it's an opportunity. And that right there completely reframes the whole meaning of why we go through hard times.
But just because the link to sin was weakened, it didn't mean suffering was just seen as random. The New Testament introduces another character who starts taking on a much bigger role as the source of human misery, Satan. Now, Satan isn't a new character. He's definitely there in the Old Testament, most famously in the book of Job, right? Where he tests a righteous man by throwing horrible things at him. But in the New Testament, he's presented way more often as this active, malicious force that is out there causing physical problems in the world. Just take the story of a woman who was bent over, crippled for 18 long years. When Jesus heals her, he doesn't bring up her sin at all. Instead, he says she's a woman whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years. You see the difference? Here, the cause of suffering isn't God's punishment. It's being held captive by a spiritual enemy. So, we've got sin, God's glory, and Satan as possible causes. But the story gets even more complex when you realize that maybe we're misunderstanding the illnesses themselves. Why? Because we keep applying our modern medical labels to these ancient texts.
The classic example is the Hebrew word tzara'at. For centuries, this word got translated as leprosy. But here's the thing, tzara'at is not Hansen's disease, the bacterial infection we call leprosy today. It was a much, much broader term, and it had less to do with a specific medical condition and way more to do with a person's spiritual state.
And here's the dead giveaway. Tzara'ats could show up on your skin, sure, but it could also appear as mildew on your clothes or as a fungus on the walls of your house. I mean, you can't catch a bacterial infection from a wall, right? So clearly they were talking about something else entirely. It was more like a concept of decay
or corruption, or what they called ritual impurity. And once you grasp that, it's a total game changer. If Tarot isn't really a disease in our modern sense, then all the rules for dealing with it, well, they weren't medical treatments. They were something completely different, religious rituals.
Just look at the process laid out in the Old Testament. Who's the one diagnosing the condition? A priest, not a doctor. And what's the whole point of the quarantine and the rituals? It was all to figure out if the person was clean or unclean. This had nothing to do with public health. It was all about whether you were fit to go to worship.
So the bottom line is this. Being declared unclean meant you are temporarily kicked out of the religious life of the community. You couldn't go to the temple. The entire system of diagnosis and cleansing was designed to restore your access to God and community, not to cure a physical sickness. It's a completely different framework for thinking about this stuff.
So what's the main takeaway here? Well, it's that the Bible's view on sickness isn't just one simple idea. It's not monolithic. It starts out as a pretty straightforward consequence of sin, but it evolves into a much richer, way more complex conversation. Sickness can be an opportunity for God's power, the work of an evil force, or just a matter of ritual purity that has nothing to do with disease as we know it today.
And so, in the end, the Bible doesn't really give us one clean, easy answer to the question of why we suffer. What it gives us instead is a record of a centuries-long debate, of people wrestling with God, with fate, and with meaning. And that's a conversation that continues right up to this day. It offers possibilities, not easy answers.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. Even with all our modern science, how do these ancient ideas about tying illness to personal failure, about seeing sickness as some kind of attack, or about isolating people who are different, how do they still echo in the way we talk about and treat illness in our own world today? Something to chew on.